For those of us that have lived in democracies all of our lives, it can be hard to imagine that people would willingly exchange a democratic system of government for an authoritarian one. We can maybe rationalize it for a nation without a long democratic tradition, or rationalize how one dictatorial regime is taken over by another. But what is it that gets a critical mass of the citizenry to accept the turn to authoritarianism? It may seem counterintuitive, but there is an often unofficial bargain that is struck between the dictator and the people. You may have heard the line from Benjamin Franklin, "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety," from which many of us derive warnings of granting the government power for the sake of individual security. And it is certainly true that many a regime promotes its existence on the basis of providing that personal security. In the United States, that was a strong pitch from the Trump campaign regarding anti-immigration and anti-crime policies, topics they usually linked, as evidenced by one of their common, completely false narratives, that immigrants had caused a rise in violent crime in the US. The reality is that immigrants, whether in the US legally or not, have lower violent crime rates than the general population. But when it comes to this kind of pitch, truth is not what is important. The perception is, and the USA has a long tradition of portraying immigrants or minorities as security threats. Think the internment camps of citizens and non-citizens alike of Japanese descent during World War II, or the increasingly virulent anti-Muslim rhetoric and actions after 9/11, the latter of which gave the United States the Patriot Act and Homeland Security, or the long history of racist characterizations of her Black, Native American, or Latine populations. Outside of the US, Vladimir Putin's rise to power was aided by his promises of securing Chechnya, something he did through the brutal destruction of the region, which it still hasn't recovered from, and what amounted to installing a Chechen dictator loyal to him personally. Much of Putin's internal propaganda also focuses on the danger of imminent threats on their borders, from countries like Georgia or Ukraine, or the existence of the defensive alliance of NATO being an existential threat to Russia, therefore the necessity of the country needing a strong leader like Putin. This pitch of safety certainly does convince a lot of people. For the United States, it's a very large share of the Republican voting base. Prior to the 2024 election, over 75% considered violent crime and immigration to be very important issues. But while this pitch may be a path to getting power, it is not actually the main pillar of keeping power when it comes to the authoritarian bargain. The main pillar of keeping power is economic security. To make my point, I'm going to return to Russia and look at the conditions leading into Putin's first term in the year 2000. Because while it may have been his promises of security that carried him into office, it was the rising economic fortunes of Russia that happened to coincide with his first two terms that secured his initial popularity, even as he dismantled Russian democracy. Between the dissolution of the Soviet Union at the end of 1991 and Putin's first election victory in spring of 2000 was an absolutely brutal economic period for the new Russian Republic. It wasn't just from the breakup of the USSR itself, but the transition to an entirely new economic system. Note, this was at the height of neoliberal economic orthodoxy, so the masterminds behind this transition operated under the belief that a rapid shift from a planned economy to a market economy, termed shock therapy, would be the best way to boost economic production and improve living conditions as quickly as possible. I have not been able to locate what time frame quickly as possible was supposed to mean, but the policies implemented for this rapid shift were devastating both for the Russian economy and for the Russian people. The final economic hit of the decade, the 1998 Russian financial crisis, left the Russian economy with a GDP 60% less than what it was in 1991. Not 60% less of the USSR's economy, just the Russian portion of the USSR's economy. Wages likewise fell by 66% in the same time frame. From 1991 to 1994, life expectancy dropped from roughly 68 years to 64 years. Alcohol abuse, long a problem in Russia, reached terrifying levels. A study conducted by David Ziridze estimated that between 1991 and 2001, 52% of Russian deaths between the ages of 15 and 54 were the result of alcohol abuse. If you draw the line back to 1987, the estimate is 3 million excess Russian lives were lost. It is worth pointing out that as terrible as shock therapy was, the USSR's and Russian economy was already on the decline before the breakup of the Soviet Union. The rapid transition exacerbated economic turmoil that already existed and had the unintended side effect of making alcohol far cheaper and easier to acquire. Then along came Putin with his pitch of bringing security to Russia. However, even before his presidency started, Russian economic fortunes had already started rising, with a huge help from a dramatic rise in oil prices, something the Russian economy and USSR's before her had become quite dependent on. According to the World Bank, from a GDP of 260 billion US dollars in the year 2000, Russia's economy grew to over 1.6 trillion by 2008. As for incomes, by percentage they improved even more, from an average monthly wage of $80 in 2000 to over $700 in 2008. This rise in Russia's and the Russian people's economic fortunes kept Putin's popularity high, even as he consolidated power by taking control of the media, expanding the internal security services, ending political competition, and harassing or silencing his opposition. With threats to his power eliminated and control of the levers of power placed in his hands, even as the Russian economy stagnated and declined after 2014, Putin's power has never been seriously threatened by widespread disapproval within the population. As another example, we can look to Hugo Chavez and his centralization of power in Venezuela over the course of his presidency from 1999 to his death in 2013. His political career started with a failed coup in 1992, for which he was pardoned after 2 years. He then successfully ran for president in 1998, being sworn into office in February 1999. For additional background on the Venezuelan economic situation, the country had been locked in a crisis for decades. Once one of the rising economies of the world in the 1970s, the 80s and 90s were tumultuous, with almost no GDP growth between 1983 and 1996. This camouflaged exactly how much worse the situation was, as Venezuela's rapidly growing population meant the stagnant economy had seen standards of living decline to the point that in 1999, despite 2 years of significant economic growth, GDP per capita was still less than Venezuela's height in the early 1980s. Chavez campaigned on a platform of ending corruption, ending poverty, and ending the old two-party system within Venezuela. On the last of these promises, by the 1998 campaign, neither of the former major parties, Acción Democrática and Comité de Organización Política Electoral Independiente, or COPE, even ran candidates for president. For comparison, this would be like the Republican and Democratic parties not running candidates for US president in 2028. As for the other goals, well, his first priority was to order a referendum on creating a new constitution. In a low turnout election, fewer than 40% participated, the initiative to form a new constitution was overwhelmingly approved. In electing the members of this assembly, Chavez-aligned candidates received 51% of the votes, but attained over 95% of the seats. With this overwhelming alignment with Chavez, the new assembly not only rewrote the constitution, but gave themselves the interim power to dismiss government officials they believed to be corrupt, before also granting themselves the interim power to overhaul the judicial system, something the Venezuelan Supreme Court actually ruled was legal. In the end, while this new constitution did provide many new rights to the citizens of Venezuela, it also significantly weakened the power of the legislature, with most of that power shifted to the office of the presidency. The new constitution also empowered the military in ways that had been expressly forbidden under the old constitution. In a subsequent low turnout election, still under 50% participation, the new constitution was passed. After running for election and winning the newly empowered presidency in 2000, Chavez used that power to enact sweeping reforms across the country, installing former military and revolutionary colleagues to positions of power, announcing dozens of new social and economic decrees, and consolidating state control of the oil industry. In early 2002, his moves at the state-run oil company Petróleos de Venezuela S.A., or PDVSA, which included replacing the president and company board with loyalists, ultimately led to civil unrest and an attempted coup against Chavez. When the military leadership initially refused to support the president, who had wanted to deploy the military against civilian protesters, he was taken into military custody, and Pedro Carmona was briefly installed as interim president. Carmona immediately announced an abolishment of the 1999 Constitution, which led to swift counter-protests in support of Chavez. With a lack of support for Carmona, he resigned, and Chavez was returned to the presidency just 2 days after being taken into custody. In the wake of this near loss of power, Chavez moderated his positions, with one of the key ones being a return of the original board of directors and upper management of PDVSA. Having gone over all of this, some of you may be asking, what's the point? What does this have to do with the economic security part of the authoritarian bargain? I laid out how Chavez was centralizing control within Venezuela to himself as the president, and the backlash to that centralization, among other radical changes he was making. There was something really important happening concurrently within the Venezuelan economy during those efforts. As these changes were coming into effect, the economy took a precipitous decline between 2001 and 2002, shrinking from over $122 billion to $92 billion, a drop of nearly 25%. Though it is worth noting that some of this decline in the back half of 2002 was from an oil workers' strike, for which, in 2003, Chavez channeled his inner Ronald Reagan and ultimately fired over 19,000 striking workers. In short, in the early part of his presidency, the economy crashed and key parts of society rose against Chavez at a time when he had not yet consolidated power. The man that temporarily replaced him, Carmona, also overplayed his hand by immediately announcing an abolishment of the 1999 Constitution. This, more than anything, was probably what provided the window of opportunity for Chavez to return to the presidency and be given a second chance to consolidate his control. By 2004, the Venezuelan economy had recovered, and when he sought re-election in 2006, there had been multiple boom years thanks to high oil prices. He won with 63% of the vote, and in short order consolidated all of the leftist political parties into a single party with himself at its lead. He also succeeded in his earlier mission of attaining more direct control of PDVSA, redirecting huge amounts of money away from new oil exploration, establishing new wells, and equipment maintenance into social and welfare programs. Simultaneously, he also nationalized a wide variety of companies, foreign and domestic alike, often handing control to personal associates. By 2009, he presented a referendum to the Constitution to abolish the 2-term limit for president to allow himself to run again in 2013. With 54% voting in favor, the referendum passed. The Venezuelan economy under Chavez ultimately peaked in 2010 at an astonishing $393 billion, before it plateaued in his final 3 years. He won a third term in 2012, but he didn't live to serve it. Dying on March 5, 2013, his vice president Nicolas Maduro took over presidential duties in violation of the Constitution. The centralization of power by Chavez in his last decade of life enabled Maduro to seize control of the government, where he remains president as of 2025, despite over a decade of economic decline. In these two examples, we see leaders of countries with both brief and long histories of democracy sliding into authoritarianism. And in both cases, it was booming economies that facilitated authoritarian consolidation of power. In fact, the economic crisis in Venezuela in 2002 nearly ended Chavez's political career as he reached too far too quickly. This is the fundamental support mechanism of the authoritarian bargain, a certain level of improvement in economic prosperity. For the maintenance of power, the math changes, in part depending on how large and ruthless the authoritarian security services can be. And it should be noted that after nearly being ousted from power, Chavez significantly increased the capabilities of the internal security services of Venezuela. But before that consolidation, the people still have the critical mass of power and influence to resist the authoritarians' takeover. The way for the dictator to at least gain acquiescence of the citizenry during that critical window is to ensure the economic prosperity and security of the general population. So we return once again to the United States and the man in charge, Donald Trump. Here, too, along with his administration, he is attempting to centralize power. Whether he succeeds is likely to hinge on the growth or decline of the US economy. At present, he seems set on a course that virtually all economists agree will lead to a recession, at best. If he continues to push for more power even as the economy falters or falls completely, well, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button. If you want to hear me talk about history and politics in the future, hit the subscribe and bell while you're at it. In the meantime, I have several videos posted for you to enjoy or critique, and I invite your input in the comments below. Until next time, take care.